G'day. Last week I did this bit. This week I did the rest of it. So I've got myself a grabber to take to the lake and try and hook some litter out. It's not perfect. There's some bits that bind. I think the spring that I've got in there needs to be a bit stronger, but it's enough that I've got something to work with. So we'll see how all that works. I'm making more bits for my grabber arm, and the basic idea is going to be a stirrup like that with a bit of round tube pulling on the inner rod, and then there'll be another, I guess you'd call it, stirrup with a bar there. So what I'm doing is I'm squeezing, and that does the actuation. I only need about 10 to 15 millimeters worth of movement to close the jaws, so that's not a big deal. However, the parts themselves are pretty vanilla ordinary, but I thought I'd mention a few tips while I'm making them. First of all, I've welded this around here, fully around both ends. Now I wanted to do that for just completeness, strength, all that sort of thing. However, once upon a time I was told by someone, oh, never weld more than 3 sides of a tube frame, and they didn't say why, but eventually I worked it out that it was probably because the air trapped inside will heat up as you're welding and try and push out. So what I've done here to enable me to do that is I've put a hole in the end there. Now that's not on center, and I'm going to have to clean that up, and I'll put another one in there which will help drain water out if it gets wet. But that's just something to remember, that when you're welding bits of tube in that contain air, you need to allow somewhere for that air to escape. If you don't, if I tried to, without that hole, if I tried to weld that, I'd get the air pushing out, it'd contaminate the weld, and I also wouldn't be able to get any metal to stick there because it'd just be blown away by the air. Not blown as in viciously, just the air would push that out the way. Second tip is about these things. These are tube cutters. This is a Rothenberger, and I think I bought this at the local plumbing shop. Plumbers use them, refrigeration mechanics use them, and a tip that I was given by a friend of mine who is a refrigeration mechanic was that when you're doing something like this, by all means use a tube cutter to cut it, but if you cut all the way through, you're going to get a burr there. So what he suggests you do is you cut, you know, a little way through like that, and it's really up to you as to how much you do, but you leave it in that state, and then, if I'm strong enough, you snap it, and that minimises the burr. I'm still going to have to go in there and deburr that, and fortunately on the back of the tool there's a fancy little spiky thing which is meant to do that, but that does give you a slightly cleaner edge. Now I'm going to use some of this for the second handle, but one thing to note too is this is anodised, and welding does not like anodised. And so what I'm going to have to do is get the angle grinder out and clean up a little bit of that so I can get a decent bead on there. You will tell anodised tubing if you try to, or anodised surfaces if you try to weld them, because they just don't want to. It's quite thick compared to the natural oxide film on aluminium. So just something else to watch for is that, yes, if you get some scrap tube from somewhere, check if it's anodised. And if you're not quite sure, you know, scrape a bit off and see whether the colour is remarkably different, because it might be that, yeah, it won't weld if you don't do that. Third set of tips. I'm making these little plugs to go in the end of the tube, because what I want to do is put a screw in there in the outer stirrup so I can take that out and remove the inner stirrup. Not a big problem there. I'll also have to make some of these for my inner tube so that I've got something to bolt both the rack on one end and the inner stirrup on the other end. But a couple of things to note. I mean, you can just blast away and make these if you want, but for starters, a normal lathe tool's got a small radius on the end. Now that doesn't matter too much, except if you want to push this tight up into the tube, it won't actually go all the way home. So what you may have to do is come in with a parting tool and just knock that radius off. I mean, the parting tool's got a small radius, but it's small enough that your deburring probably covers it. Next thing is that This is, I parted this off from the bar there, and you can see there's a leftover hole where I've drilled through for my tapped hole. That's actually a bad thing. And what I'm going to do is go in with a centre drill and sort of try and re-centre that. Because what can happen is a drill can wander, and if it wanders and goes off centre, it tends to stay that way. But if I just put a drill in there now and said, oh, I've got a centre mark already, that'll accentuate that. So what I need to do is come in with a centre drill and clean that up. Apart from that, I'm just going to then part that off, so I have another one of these, and that will, I can then push that into the plug. I can weld around there. The hole in there will let the hot air out. So you know, I'm all set. I've been making up a couple of bushings. This one is to go into the rack of the grabber, so in there. And what I want to do is put a hole in there for a pin. And the pin will just be a bit of welding rod, TIG filler rod. But the reason for that is I don't want that rotating. Once that's welded in, if that bolt spins, it means I can't get the nut on the other end off, and that'll be a nylock. And so that'll cause me all sorts of grief. So I'm going to put the pin in there to lock it in place. Once the tube goes over that, the pin won't be able to come out anyway. So that's all good. On the other end, I've got a bush like that, and that is going to have, when I put the hole in there, that's going to have the handle on like that. That one doesn't worry me quite so much because I'll be able to see if that one comes loose. It's more this end that I don't particularly want the rack falling off or something like that. So what I'm going to do here is I'll just put a nut on there to secure the bolt in there. And then I'll put this bush on, which I've already tapped. And by some strange and lucky coincidence, because these have both been taken out of 16mm bar, that's actually cylindrical. And so I'll come along here in a V-block, drill that, and everything will be wonderful. Then I can weld that into the end of my tube, and I'll have something for the grabber to attach to. I've made up a bush for the other end of my outer tube, and I want to weld some 25 flat on there and then come off it at the appropriate angle. Now, that's flat, that's round. Filling those edges isn't going to be much fun. So what I want to do is actually form the aluminium strip before I actually get to it. Now, if you're like me and haven't got three hands, one of the ways that I'd sometimes do these things is hold my forms in place with a strip of masking tape or something like that. And so what I'm going to do here is, using the hydraulic press, push that down into a V-block, and what that does is gives me a form, something like that. Right? And that'll fit in there quite nicely. There's a little bit of shearing here at the corners, but that's okay because when I weld that in, I can come along and touch that up. But I've now got the basis of that form. I can then put another bend in here where I need it, and I'm well on my way to a handle. In the middle of what would you call it, a welding break at the moment. So I've welded the grabber handle onto my bit of 25mm tube, and I'm quite happy with that because I haven't managed to blow holes through the tube or distort the inside, so that's all good. I've also welded the plug with the thread on it into the end of the tube. As I said, that thread is pinned, so that's not going to rotate, and that'll allow me to put the rack piece on there, put a nut in there. It'll actually be a nylock nut, so that I can move this in and out of the tube here, and the grippers will grip, so that's good. At the moment I'm welding up the outside of the handle, that's the inside. I got the width wrong, and so I've got to do a bit of a cutting and shutting to get that back to where I want it. What I want to do is put a couple of acetal blocks either side, U-shaped blocks, that'll just act as a guide for this handle, so that when you pull it, it's not going to twist or do anything like that. As you can see, it does its thing, which is great. I just need to get the handle sorted out on the other end, trim down those jaws, and away we go. I've machined my grabber arm, so I've put it's basically weight reduction groove in there, and taken this back down to, so that's 20. I've overshot a little bit and got some notches there, which I prefer not to have, but oh well, that's the way it works. Earlier on, I sort of mentioned that I put this hole in the wrong spot, or the hole had gone in the wrong spot, and I'd have to fix that up, and I wanted to do that anyway. And the question is how. Now, this V-block, it's another one of those things that arrived in a box of miscellaneous that someone gave me, and it's a Starrett. It's got a couple of funny things down here which I'm not worried about, but two things it has which will make it ideal for this is it's got the clamp piece, but it's also got 3/8 by 16 UNC tapped holes in here. So I've got an angle plate, I've got a couple of bits of studding, bolts through here, and that's holding that. I've now centered up the mill on this piece of tube, which is the same size as this one, and so what I'm going to be able to do is take that out, put that one in, and that should be on the same center. So I can come in with a 1/2 inch cutter, slot drill, and just take that out, and that should just fit nicely. I've come to putting the slots in my guides, and as you can see that slides reasonably well. I'm going to clean up those welds just a little bit, but I was expecting to do that, so that's not a major imposition. I've got enough meat here that I can use either a taps, threaded screw, or what I'll probably end up doing is using a wood screw to hold these on, just because plastic takes a wood screw quite nicely, and it's not a precision sort of thing. One thing I was going to point out, this was actually the reason I made this vise up. I wanted a small vise that I could clamp to an angle plate, and this is just an interim sort of thing until I can make something a little bit wider and all that sort of thing. But this was the idea, because previously to cut this slot I would have either had to convert the mill into a horizontal mode, and that's quite a bit of effort, as some of you may have seen from previous videos, or I would have had to use an end mill. Now, rule of thumb for an end mill, of course, is that you don't want to go in any more than half the diameter as the depth of cut. For plastic, you could probably stretch that a little bit, but this slot is 7mm deep, so it's still going to take a few passes to do that. And I find too that with end mills, particularly small ones, they tend to deflect a little bit, and so you don't necessarily get a nice square cut, shall we say. Whereas a slitting saw does it beautifully. So that's what I made this for. And you can probably start to appreciate, if you're new to milling, how much accessories help you get where you want to go. To summarise where I am, this bit was welded on, but what I've done is I've put what you'd call a spring cup in there, I guess. Basically a sleeve, the OD there, with a bit of a step to hold the back of this spring, and the idea of the spring is to kick the jaws out when you release the handle. I'm hoping it's strong enough. It's another one of these experimental things, so we may have to do that again, but the spring will go in there, and then the inner goes in, like so, and you can see that kicks that out, and so I can now mount the jaws on there, and that will, fingers crossed, flick them out. up this end I've got my inner handle and the outer handle. For those of you wondering, you know, why so big? Well, I've got biggish hands, but also I'm thinking that it might be the sort of thing that I want to use with gloves on, and so having them big enough to use with gloves, it's probably not a bad idea. This feels a little bit tight, and the spring isn't returning terribly well, but that's all right. We'll work on that. I might need a bigger spring or an alternative springing arrangement, maybe something up this end as well. I've only just tacked the handle in place here because I figure, well, it's in compression, and I may want to take that off to do other things with this anyway. So there we go. So I've now got a 2 metre long grabber, and well, thanks for watching. See you for the next one.